Hello, everybody. I want to say thank you for joining us today, as we're really excited to share with you our best practices and lessons learned from tracking 1 trillion events. My name is Aditya of Amplitude. I'll be moderating the webinar today, and a few housekeeping items that I want to address. We'll be recording the webinar, and it'll be available after the webinar happens for folks who have attended as well as folks who haven't attended. And we will be giving away an iPad Pro to one of the attendees, and also we'll be live tweeting. And so follow @Amplitude Mobile to see the tweets as well as retweet any of the information we put out there. With that, I want to introduce our co-founder and CEO, Spenser Skates.
Thank you very much, Aditya, for that introduction. Appreciate it a ton. Thank you all for joining today on this webinar. I know we have quite a few guests, so looking forward to hearing from some of you and some of your questions, and then sharing some of the lessons that I've learned over the last few years in running Amplitude. So this is best practices and lessons learned from 1 trillion events tracked. So just a quick introduction about myself. I'm Spenser Skates. Excuse me. I'm Spenser Skates, CEO and co-founder of Amplitude. I started Amplitude a little over 4 years ago with my co-founder to help companies build better products. Over that time, we've gotten the great opportunity to work with over 15,000 different products, and through the course of that, we've tracked 1 trillion user actions. And that was really a big milestone for us, and so it caused us and it caused me to reflect a little bit on the things that we've learned over the course of that time. Here are the 4 lessons that I wanted to share with all of you today. So I'll go through them in detail. Throughout this presentation, we'll also be doing a few poll questions for the audience. So go ahead, when those come up, I'll just give you a heads up, and we'll give folks on the call about a minute to answer the poll. And then after we go through these lessons, we'll wrap it up with some Q&A for the audience. All right, so let me go into my first lesson today. Retention matters. Now, retention matters. This might sound obvious to a lot of you on the call, and a lot of you who have been working with Amplitude and involved with Amplitude over the last few years. But this often gets lost at a lot of companies and a lot of product teams that I've seen. And so to explain how I came to really understand the importance of retention, I want to tell you a little bit about my path before Amplitude. So it all started when me and my co-founder Curtis left our jobs to start Sonal. So at the time, Curtis was at Google, and I was trying to convince him to leave his job to come start a Silicon Valley tech startup, because that was the dream. I was personally super excited about that, and I was like, man, we're gonna go change the world. We're gonna come out to Silicon Valley and start something super impactful. And I was a little worried because a lot of other people I knew that had gone to Google never came out. It's kind of like you got assimilated into the Google hive mind. But to his credit, Curtis eventually did leave Google. It did take a little bit of nudging from my end, so I ended up moving out to California and moving in on Curtis's bedroom floor on a mattress for 4 months before he left. But then he did leave, and we ended up starting a company called Sonal. So for those of you who don't know, Sonal is a voice recognition app. And what it allows you to do is allows you to safely send and receive text messages while you drive by talking to your phone. So it has this really cool action where what it allows you to do, you can talk to your phone, and so you can basically, you don't even have to look at your phone. You can just have your phone in your pocket and then have it have a conversation with you. It even worked while the screen was off and the phone was asleep. So the app would be running in the background, constantly listening on the microphone, and it would listen for your voice in the background. Now, we took about 2 months to launch that. That was in late 2011. We took about 2 months to launch that product, we got a bunch of coverage in TechCrunch and Lifehacker, and so that was super exciting for us. What happened after that was, we applied to YC, we got into Y Combinator into the winter 2012 batch, and that was super exciting. And we really, really wanted Sonal to grow. So we went through YC, we gave one of the best demo day presentations at the end of Y Combinator, and that was that was awesome because we had like 7 or 8 different tech media cover us, and as a result, we saw a big spike up in users. So we saw that the user growth, we were getting thousands of users and thousands of downloads, and we were kind of living the Silicon Valley dream. We were super excited, and things were looking good for us. But what happened after that is we noticed our user base was decreasing over time. A lot of individuals would download the application, but they wouldn't stick around. And after doing some digging and investigation to that, we found out it was because we were failing to retain our users within the application. And so what would happen is, yes, someone would download the app and then they wouldn't have a good experience, and so they wouldn't come back. And so as a result, our user base really ended up dropping off over time. And so this is a graph of that happening. We wanted to solve that, so we wanted to figure out how to improve and how to really improve retention. And we wanted to, at the time, Facebook had a famous study that had come out that had shown that one of the best predictors of retention was how many friends you added. So if you had added 7 or more friends within Facebook, the product, your chance at retaining at least 2 months or more was 85%. And if you didn't get over that threshold, you were much, much, much less likely to stick around. And so we wanted to figure out what was our 7 friends moment in Sonal. So we looked at a number of analytics platforms out there to measure other retention and other important metrics, but nothing really suited our needs. A lot of other products could tell us what our retention was, but none of them could do a really good job of telling us how to improve how to improve our retention. They couldn't tell us the difference between users who were well retained and users who weren't, and that was really the key for us in order to try to figure out our own growth. So as a result, we ended up building our own analytics infrastructure. Like any good engineer with a healthy dose of hubris, we said, hey, how hard can it be to do that? So this is a picture of me and Curtis tooling away in our apartment, trying to build Sonal and build our own analytics infrastructure. As it turns out, building analytics infrastructure takes a lot of time. We actually probably spent about half our engineering time between myself and Curtis trying to build our own analytics. And so we ended up starting out with just a log file, and then a log file didn't work for some of the retention calculations we're trying to do, so we moved over to a SQLite database, and turns out SQLite, there's a reason it's called SQLite because it doesn't really scale well. So then we ended up moving over to MySQL database. And through all of that, we wanted to answer some questions about how, what was it that our retained users had in common. And so the first question that we looked at was we wanted to know how correlated was the accuracy of the voice recognition to the retention of our users. As it turns out, our data showed that it was extremely important. So someone who had a match on the first contact, someone who had a match on the first time they tried to use the app was twice as likely to retain long-term than someone who didn't. So that told us that, if you could just get that first match, you can make that first voice recognition event in the app work, then you were twice as likely to retain a user. So it's extremely important to retention. We were looking at, and we came to the conclusion with Sonal that someone who had a successful voice recognition match was more than 2 times likely to be retained in the application. So even though we had this great insight, we were really only 2 engineers at the time, and the rate at which we could improve existing technology was a losing battle. But in talking to other companies in our Y Combinator class and other companies we knew within Silicon Valley, we realized there was a much bigger opportunity for us. We could actually help other companies get the same sort of insights about their product. Other companies we talked to actually wanted to get an understanding of their user base so that they could improve retention as well, because they found retention important as well, but they just didn't have the tools to. So it's not that just other startups that we knew and other companies we knew that cared about retention. One of the things that we saw was that the top apps in the App Store also had really great retention. So this is a graph of the retention rate of products in the App Store ranked by their ranking. So if you look at it, the red line at the top shows the top 10 apps, and by day 90, they're still retaining more than half their users. But if you look at, let's say the next 5,000 apps, so the green line at the bottom, by day 90, your retention rate is less than 10%. And so if you look at that, it wasn't just that it wasn't just the rate of user growth that's important to being a top app. What's actually much more important and much more correlated is how well you retain. And so we knew overall through this that, it's not just companies we knew, but most companies that had a product in the App Store cared about retention. When we started Amplitude, one of the things we did was we did research on what made a really good SaaS company. As it turned out, SaaS companies really care about this metric called churn. Churn is the inverse of retention. And so this line, these set of lines here show the growth rate of a startup on the basis of different churn rates, assuming constant top of funnel. So if you can get negative net churn, which is effectively negative retention, where your user base grows over time, where your existing companies that use you grow over time, then you can have a much, much higher growth rate. So that's that blue line at the top. Whereas if you have high churn, which is the same as low retention, that gray line at the bottom, your growth rate will be much, much, much slower. And so that was, it wasn't that just products, if you're a mobile app that you cared about retention. It was also if you're a SaaS company that you cared about retention. And then one broader thing that I've taken away over the last few years is that retention matters for all businesses, not just SaaS companies. And so how many people on this call are part of a mileage program? So airline programs like Southwest or United or pretty much every airline out there has developed an entire rewards program and loyalty program to help retain their users better. And so if you look at the history of really of top companies, basically, oh, and sorry, the slides are a little, I think the fonts here are a little messed up, but just ignore that. If you look at the top companies and what they've managed to do consistently across a broad range of industries, so from retail to consumer to airlines to even if you're a consulting business, retention is the most important thing. And so that has really crystallized for me over the last 4 years that retention matters, and if you want a successful business, the biggest difference between being successful and unsuccessful is whether you can have good retention. So that's the first lesson learned, retention matters. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to our second lesson today. So our second lesson today is what users do is much more important than who they are. So to go through this story, I want to tell a little one of the stories of our customers. So over the course of working with 15,000 products, I want to tell you the story of one of those products, a marketplace product, who came to us and they specifically wanted to know how they can improve their retention and ultimately make more revenue as a company. What we did is we worked with them to get an understanding of segmenting their user base along different dimensions to understand which segments really impacted retention. So we started off by looking at a bunch of demographic segments. So this is the first thing we looked at, and one of the things that matters a lot for marketplaces is countries. And so we looked at different countries and to see how the retention rate of users changed across countries. And so here you see, by the end of it, United States is slightly above some of the other countries within the data set. And so, okay, country, not super impactful. Let's look at some other slices of the data. So we looked at city with them. City actually, or excuse me, state. So state can be a common segment. So it looks like Colorado is a little slightly higher on some days than some of the other ones, but also, again, not super impactful. And so then we looked at other things. We looked at device type. We looked at what phones people use, because often, a lot of companies have seen that, iOS versus Android, that there can often be a big difference. But it turned out there actually was not a big difference in the retention rate of users based on the device that they had used. So instead of looking at a lot of these demographic segments, we decided to look at some of the behaviors and actions users engage with in the application. And we looked at much, much, much bigger difference. So we looked at users who sent a message. So this is comparing all users, so the baseline, to users who had sent a message to a seller within the context of the marketplace. And so the green line is the users who had sent a message, and the blue line is the baseline. As you can see, there's more than 4x higher retention from users who sent a message to the seller. And so what that told this marketplace product was that the behaviors of their users was much more important than any sort of demographic data that they could obtain about their user base. And so that if they were wanting to focus on increasing the retention of their users, it actually wasn't about targeting users in specific geos or with specific phones. It was about getting users to engage with this particular feature set message. And as it turns out, it's not just us. Earlier I talked about Facebook's example. Facebook, really, one of the things that led it to be such a successful company was that from a product perspective, they really focused on adding 7 friends. And in comparison to a lot of other companies, right? You look at Orkut, who was really focused on Brazil and India as a market. Facebook was able to grow significantly larger because instead of focusing on a demographic segmentation, they were focusing on a user behavior segmentation. And so the takeaway I want you all to have here is that slicing by demographic really limits you. So if you see a lift in retention for a specific relocation, well, let's say you see that users in San Francisco have the highest retention. Well, what happens if you acquire all the users there? That's it. You're limiting yourself. Whereas if you slice instead on behavior, users can come from any demographic. And so, in this graphic here, if you're looking at the Western United States, you're missing out on a lot of the rest of the country, and you're really limiting yourself to the set of users that you can go after. And so while your competitors, this is a Billboard. So Billboard is a classic example of demographic segmentation because it's explicitly, sitting in a single location. While your competitors are thinking about demographics, you should be thinking about behaviors to drive to your goals. And so really the takeaway is that what your users do is much more impactful to your retention rate than who your users are. So now I wanted to dive into our third lesson, the third lesson that I've internalized, which is know your product's value. So as part of this, I wanted to tell you the story of one of our customers, Calm, and how they discovered something surprising about the value that they were delivering to their users. So first, some background on them. Calm is a mindfulness and meditation app. What it does is it guides users through a series of meditation exercises over the course of 10 to 15 minutes. Things like breathing exercises, stretching exercises, different poses, and with the idea that meditating will help bring you peace of mind. And so they came to us wanting to know the same thing, which is how do we improve user retention? And so as we know from lesson 1, retention matters for all businesses because it ultimately determines their long-term growth and success. And Calm knew this too, which is why they were focused on trying to discover ways they could better retain users. And as we know from lesson 2, understanding how users behave is a fundamental first step to improving retention. And so Calm wanted to know, what do users who stick around in the product do differently from other users, right? So what behaviors characterize Calm's power users, and how can they deliver and bring that value to the rest of their user base? So they came up with a bunch of hypotheses and actually uncovered something really amazing. And so they found this particular group of users that were 3 times better retained than the rest of the users. So the red line, the blue line is kind of their baseline retention, and the red line was this special group of users who was much more engaged and much more retained. And they wanted to know, okay, right, who are these users? Now, looking at what they did have was they had this particular action in common. And so they then looked at how many users actually performed this action, and it was less than 1% of their users were actually doing this mystery event. So what was that event? So it turns out this feature was buried deep within the app under a ton of screens. To get to this feature, users first had to click Profile, scroll to the bottom of profile, find settings, hit mindfulness reminder, and then turn a mindfulness reminder on. And so what this feature was, it was setting a reminder to remind you in the future that it's a good time to meditate. And so what they discovered as a part of that was the core of their product value was not just that running you through a meditation session, it was actually also reminding you to meditate at the right time. And so what they did was they brought out and they had a prompt that after your first meditation session, they would ask you to set a reminder. And as it turned out, 40% of users who saw that prompt did in fact turn on that reminder. So, and then on top of that, they could replicate the earlier findings, and they found even though so many more users were doing it, everyone who's turned on a reminder still had 3 times higher the retention. That was a really, really surprising thing for them, that they didn't really, getting their users to build a habit around meditation was super important too. It wasn't just actually doing the meditation that was important to the retention. And so by helping users set that reminder for them to meditate at the right time, they encourage their users to build a habit around meditation. So great. So what do you do once you discover insights like this about your product and about your users? Well, what's the next step? Well, we have a lot of great content on our blog on how to be strategic about leveraging behavioral insights to improve retention and grow your business. We've also developed a retention playbook that will be released in the next couple months that has a great framework for measuring your retention and discovering ways to hook your users to your product. So you should definitely check that out. So we'll send that out as well after this webinar. So just to recap, know your product value because it can be unexpected. And to be successful, you need to retain your users and center your product around that value and get your users to experience it as soon as possible. All right, great. So we're going to go ahead and get to the last lesson of today, which is user-shaped product. So we have a post that just came out on the Amplitude blog that talks more in depth, where I talk more in depth about the shift. Please go check it out. So I want to tell you a quick story about how software development used to be done. For those of you who don't know, this is a picture of a gold release copy. Back in the old days of software development, before everyone had instant access to download anything from the internet or their smartphone, research and development was actually super disconnected from users actually using the product. And so what would happen is product was seen as a cost center, where what you do is you spend a lot of time in research and development for months or years before you release the product, and then you'd come out with a gold release copy, and then that gold release copy was used as the master copy for distribution. And then that was then boxed up and put in packaged product and sold on retail store shelves. So if you ever bought software, back in the 80s or 90s, this is how you would have to get it. And as a result, product was seen as a cost center. Now, if you look at today, we have super easy access to all kinds of applications on your phone, and updates happen frequently. And so, this is just expected now as part of using a product. It's not just a static thing at a point in time that you're downloading, but it's continually getting better over time. And so the best companies have really embraced this trend. They've embraced the trend of the shift to product as a revenue driver. And so Facebook is a perfect example of this, where they have what they call a growth team. And what the growth team is really a product team. They're a product team that's helping understand, okay, well, what changes can we make on product to drive long-term growth of the product? And so product is now, instead of being seen as an investment, long-term investment and a cost center in a business, it's now being seen as a revenue center. So, and as a result, Facebook as a product has evolved a ton over the last few years. They started out with doing profiles, and then they did photos, and then applications, and then newsfeed, and then now it's this massive platform. And so I wanted to give you a story about how users shaped a product I use a ton. So this is the Yelp app, and I'm a big user. They're not an Amplitude customer, but I had a really cool experience with using the Yelp app about a year ago. So before, in the old days, before the Yelp had this update, here is what you had to do. So I would often be hungry, so I'd search for restaurants that were nearby me, and I'd often want to look at restaurants that are open now. So I'd hit the filter menu, I'd check the checkbox that says open now, and then I'd redo the search. Now, that's a little cumbersome. I had to click through, a bunch of different times and go through 4 or 5 screens in order to get there. Now, something really cool happened in the last year to their product. So if you look at the update they did, here's what happened. Here's the result of what happened afterwards. So you do the same search, restaurants, and now the Open Now menu, or the Open Now button, instead of having to go in the filter list, it's right there at the top of the screen. And so now the same sort of experience on that I do is only requires 2 or 3 clicks and only 1 search, and it's much, much easier. And as a result, I use the Yelp app way more. Now, it might seem crazy because it's like, okay, well, were you really not going to use it before? Well, yes. Like, whether I decide to do the search actually depends a lot for me on how hard that search is. So by making the search twice as easy, I'm using the product a ton more, and so I'm much more engaged user within the context of that application. And so basically, so how'd they do that? Well, what probably happened was they had a product manager who worked at Yelp and who looked at the most common actions done when someone clicks the filter menu, and they saw that Open Now was at the top of that list because I use that a lot, and probably because a lot of other Yelp users use that a lot. And so they said, hey, well, what if we could make that user flow work much, much more easily? And so what they did was they came out and they said, okay, well, yeah, let's put a set of buttons on the top of the screen that contain the most common filters and that allows people to search and find the set of filters that they want much more easily. And as a result, the Yelp as a product has shaped how it works in order to match my working style. And that's awesome. And so this is the future of software. And so imagine if your analytics product could tell you, hey, this is a super common path that your users are doing. Maybe you should think about optimizing it. Then you get something that's much more valuable and much more powerful. And the best products are the products that are going to be doing this, and products who don't adapt to user behavior are the ones who are going to be left behind because they're not giving their users a really good experience. I also wanted to share a really quick side story as well. So Square is one of our customers. Square operates in this way by letting users shape their products. So they use Amplitude in a number of different places, Square Register, Square Cash, their Caviar product, as well as a few others. And one of the great things is they have everyone in the company looking at this data all the time. So it's not just some analyst goes off and runs a report. It's everyone is thinking about how my users are, how their users are acting right now. And so, they have, so it's data scientists, they have product managers, they have marketing to execs, to engineers who are running A/B tests. And so that's the way, by constantly getting your company and the people in your company who have an influence on product to understand what your users are doing so that you can shape their product around it. That's how companies are going to be run in the future, and that's how users will ultimately shape products. And so the last thing I wanted to share is that users really shaped our product at Amplitude. And so I wanted to share 4 different ways that happened. So I'm going to go ahead and go through them. So before, we had this feature called event flows. And the deal with event flows, it showed the most common paths that users were taking through your application. And so what would happen is users would click through a series of trees to see, okay, well, what sort of things are my users doing within the application? Now, that was great, but one super common complaint was that you'd have to click through multiple sets of trees, right? And it kind of gets exponentially, the number of combinations grows exponentially with the depth of the tree. And so you could spend a really long time exploring what the most common paths were. And so with the launch of Amplitude 2.0, we've actually changed this to what we call Pathfinder that allows you to see multiple levels from multiple events at the same time. And so you can get an understanding of not just the top layer really quickly, but you can understand how that goes through to the second layer and the third layer and the fourth layer in terms of what people's actions are. And so that was an attempt on our end to change Amplitude as a product to respond to what the common actions that people were taking with Pathfinder. So the next thing I wanted to share with you about users, how it shaped our product, was growth accounting. So for those of you who are not familiar with growth accounting, this is a way to get an understanding of your user base and how your user base is growing and changing over time. And basically the way it works is you start off with looking at how many users you have in your current period. You add in the number of resurrected users, so users from previous periods who have left but now are coming back, and then the number of new users, and then you subtract the number of users who have churned, and the sum of those four things gives you how many users you have in the next period. And so this is a really great tool to identify what areas you need to improve on as a product. Do you have high churn? Do you have not enough users coming top of funnel? Do you have a problem with just too small of a user base right now? And what we saw was that a lot of companies were doing this one-off manual analysis to be put in their board decks or to be shared across the team in Excel. And so what we did was we created that as part of Amplitude 2.0, where we actually do the growth accounting for you. And so we show how your user base is growing and changing over time and what the biggest areas to improve that are. And so that you no longer have to do that with an Excel spreadsheet. And the third thing I want to share with you, so this is a screenshot of the legacy app, so the product before the Amplitude 1.0, before we launched 2.0. And one of the things you'll notice here is that the controls here are super involved. There's like a ton of buttons. There's probably like 20 different controls across the screen. And there's like a panel at the top. There's some stuff on the graph. There's the segmentation bar on the right, and then there's navigation on the top. And so one of the challenges with this, this was great for power users, but for someone looking at this graph for the first time, they often found it really challenging in terms of where to start. So a power user would share a graph with someone else within with someone else within their organization, but then they wouldn't have a really quick and easy way to understand what it was they were looking at. And so as a result, we changed our product to make that much simpler. So all the information about how to interpret a graph is now within this box at the top. And so you can just read left to right and get an understanding of exactly what you're looking at. So here we're looking at monthly active users, which is the title, and then top events performed by all users measured by uniques. So very, very much more straightforward to get an understanding of what you're interpreting and looking at. So the last thing that I wanted to share with how users shaped our product was one thing that users were doing a ton was they'd send email reports to each other, and they'd often copy and paste screenshots of what they were doing with an Amplitude into other programs like Slack. And so we were like, how can we make that interaction be a lot more straightforward and a lot more easy? Well, as a result, we came out with a Slack integration where when you paste the link, it will just show the image within the channel directly. And so that was a way where we said, hey, let's optimize something our users are currently doing and just make it easier and faster. And so, to wrap up, it's super important that you have your users shape your product, because products that do a good job of that are gonna beat the competition. Like, it used to be that you could just make a product and that your users would have to adapt to whatever things that that product is doing. But in the future, the way it's going to go more and more is that users will end up shaping your products. All right, so that's the 4 lessons learned today. Number 1, just to recap, number 1, retention matters. Number 2, what your users do matters more than who they are. Number 3, know your product's value. And number 4, users shape product. So now we're going to open it up to the audience to ask any questions that they want. I will pass it over to Aditya.
Great. Thanks, Spencer. I'm sure the audience was really excited to hear a lot about the lessons learned that we had. I've seen some of the questions here, and they're great questions. One of the questions is, how did Calm find that segment was performing so much better using Amplitude?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to talk about that. What Calm did was that they just looked at a bunch of different things that users could do, and I think set a mindfulness reminder was just one of those. They had like a few hundred different events, and so they just looked event by event at those different events to get an understanding of, does doing that event impact retention a ton? And what happened was, a lot of them had some correlation to retention, because you expect a lot of behaviors to have correlation to retention, but what really stuck out was that one was like 4x higher than the baseline. The other thing that I think happened was that one super common paradigm within lifestyle products is to set a reminder to help you build a habit. So if you're like an exercise product, or you're, in Calm's case, they were like a meditation product, setting a reminder ends up being a really good way to help your users form a habit. And so that also, was like a signal that, hey, we should look at, does this feature actually lead to improved retention?
With that, we have another great question. Facebook's launch strategy did start with demographic, though, colleges first. Are you perhaps suggesting an intersection of demographics as well as what users do?
Yeah, I think so. My point around demographics is not so much that like demographics don't matter at all. It's more that behaviors are more important. So according to the Chamath, who was the former head of growth at Facebook, the single most important product insight was the social network component of Facebook, the adding friends. And so, in retrospect, we can say, oh, that's obvious. Yeah, social networks were a big deal, but it wasn't obvious to them at the time. I think, MySpace had made a big investment in understanding, in making you edit and shape your page, and it was all about your page. It wasn't really about, what friends you were adding. They, had that default friend, Tom, that you could add. And so what Facebook had an understanding was that the friends piece was the most important piece. And so what they did was they cut out a lot of other things from the onboarding experience. They cut out, uploading a lot of photos or filling out a ton about your profile, and they really just focused you on adding friends. They had your friends suggest friends, and they just, whatever it was they could do to get you over that threshold during the onboarding experience. Now, don't get me wrong, Facebook invested a ton in demographics. There's a reason they started off at colleges, and then they expanded to schools and workplaces, and then to all users in the US. And they did do a ton of customizations by demographic. But the really driving thing, the reason Facebook didn't stop in terms of growth overall and becoming a kind of preeminent social network was because they had an understanding that at the end of the day, no matter where you are, it's the friends that are important. So I guess I'd say Facebook kind of did the best of both worlds, where they had a really great understanding that behaviors in the product were most important. And then secondarily after that, they did a ton of stuff to customize based on demographic.
Great. So we want to launch we're going to continue answering the QA. I just want to launch one more poll. Actually, don't worry about the poll. We'll go to the next question. What's the difference between rolling retention and end-day retention?
So rolling retention, let me just define those for people on the call. So end-day retention is a very simple look at retention. What end-day retention is it says on the nth day, how many users are coming back. So, on the 30th day, or on the 31st day, or on the 32nd day, how many users are coming back. Now, that makes sense for a lot of applications that are based on daily interaction. So if you're a social network or you're a game, end-day retention is a great way to measure your user base. Now, for a lot of applications, though, that's not the case. You don't expect your users to come back on a daily basis. So a much better way to look at that in a lot of cases is rolling retention. What rolling retention is it looks at your users over a longer time period. So let's just take an example, rolling 30-day retention. Rolling 30-day retention will look at, for any particular day, the last 30 days, and how many users were active over those last 30 days. And so for products with a monthly cadence instead of a daily cadence, that's a much better measure of how many users they have engaged. So the way to think about that is rolling retention is like kind of it's like a summary or an aggregation of end day retention.
Okay, great. Another question that we have is, what could be considered noise? If retention rates are plus or minus 1%, should we really focus on that being different, or should we really look for a big separation?
Yeah, you absolutely want to start off with the big separation, and that was my point when talking about the second lesson that I was talking about, which is what users do is more important than who they are. Like, if you look, most companies are not even like looking at the right, not even looking at really basic behavioral things. And you can often find massive differences in retention, like often like 2 or 3x, if you're looking at really, really simple behaviors. And so, what we found is that, like, I think historically, you look at how marketing looks at the world, and it's a lot about, okay, we're trying to acquire this demographic of users or this group of users, or, users within this age range or from this geo or with this type of phone. And because, because one group retains slightly better than another. And the point that I really wanted to share with all of you today is that, those sort of differences are just tiny compared to the differences that you see within a product on the basis of behavior. And so, if you're spending that much to optimize for super small differences in retention when it comes to different demographics, you really should be, there's much lower hanging fruit, and there's much higher leverage that you can get out of by just making small investments to understand what behaviors are really driving engagement with your product.
Great. Another question, Spencer, we came across is, can we use profile data as a factor for building cohorts in Amplitude alongside actions taken? So profile data meaning male, female, maybe age or location alongside of the behaviors themselves.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, so, one, I definitely want to encourage you to look at the behavior, but absolutely. We track a bunch out of the box. So we'll track location and geo and device type and a few other things. And then if your users fill out profile data like what gender or age or other things, you can absolutely track those through what we call user properties. So those are attributes attached to a user. And then you can segment and see, okay, do this age range or this demographic, this gender have a higher retention rate or higher engagement rate or whatever it is you're looking at in your product. But the real takeaway, again, I definitely don't want people to miss it, is that stuff just tends to be much lower leverage when it comes to improving retention in a product than looking at the first set of actions a user does when they come on board.
Awesome. Another question, pretty open-ended, I think pretty awesome question actually. What would your solution be for Pokemon? Right now, a few people are using the app. I think we had a great blog post on this, but this follows up on that blog post.
Yeah, I mean, games is kind of the classic, like, just games as an industry is a classic hits-driven business where you have this big spike and then, it's the hot thing for a few months and then it drops off, and that's just the nature of the industry. I do think that what some of the most successful games have really done a great job of doing is they pioneered a lot of, if you look at Zynga or you look at Supercell, you look at Rovio, what they really pioneered is kind of these how to keep users engaged long term through these behavioral loops. So, coming back to get your reward or coming back to do XYZ within the application. And so before launching, they did this. So, in terms of Pokemon Go, I don't think they realized it was going to be such a hit beforehand, but if they had, what they probably would have done is spent more time figuring out that retention loop within the application. And so having some sort of thing that encourages you to use the application, battle your friends or collect something on a daily basis. And they just didn't do that. There wasn't much to the game when they first launched. And so, like, the ones that are most successful over the longest period of times, if you look at, Candy Crush, or you look at, Clash of Clans, or now Clash Royale, what they've done a really good job of is optimizing that, those sort of the behaviors that lead to someone being retained long term before having that big launch. Because if you have that, we had that happen with Sonal where we had that spike up and then trailing off. And so if you're not doing that before you get your moment in the spotlight, then you're really leaving, a big opportunity on the table.
Cool. Question about Amplitude. Can we create cohorts based on retention and behaviors in Amplitude? For example, cohort of users who had 50% day one retention on a certain day.
Cohort of users. Sorry, say that again, Aditya.
So the question is basically, can we create cohorts based on retention and behaviors in Amplitude? So if someone had a cohort, we create a cohort of users who have 50% of retention on day one on a certain day.
Okay, yeah. So I mean that's a really good question. So the answer to that is yes, absolutely. You can create cohorts on the basis of whether someone was retained one day later. We can, if you're interested in learning how to do that, just shoot us a note afterwards, and we'd be happy to walk you through that in the product. It's actually pretty straightforward. We have this really cool thing called Microscope, where you can click on any data point and say, hey, I want to turn this group of users into a cohort of users. So the way to do that in Amplitude would be to look at a retention graph, look at the users who retained day one, and then just click on that data point and say, okay, let's create a cohort out of that group of users.
Great. So here's a pretty interesting one about how we developed the Slack integration. How did you find out what your users were doing outside your product? For example, pasting graph screenshots in Slack.
Yeah. So that's one that analytics data cannot tell you. That's one that you have to get from talking with your customers. It's in terms of making a great product, it's not just analytics that will do that. It's also really getting an in-depth understanding of who your customer really is and what they're doing. And there was there's obviously no way for us to tell that just on the basis of like what people are doing with Amplitude. There's no way, it's like not like we can track, what they're doing outside of our product. So we found that out. It was just a super common user request, and I think we asked around our customer base and found that like a really high percentage of them were using Slack. And then after digging into that more, like we saw the common behavior was to post a screenshot in the Slack, and so that was like, okay, this is something that users want to do a lot. And so it's what I would say in that, it's not just looking at the data. I think it's looking at the data with combining that with talking to your users that can really lead to you building a product that's shaped to the experiences of your users.
Great. So just want to say thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been really great answering your questions, and hopefully you got a lot of value out of what Spenser has talked about, his 4 lessons from looking at 1 trillion events over the last 4 years. We'll be following up in an email announcing the winner, as well as a link to the recording. So once again, thank you for your time, and I really appreciate you guys joining us today.